If we have clothes, we have shelter, we have food, then we have what we need to exist. He argues that geography matters. So, for instance, the United States is known for having a long trail of rivers and a lot of arable farmland. And it's important for our country. And Mexico, on the other hand, has mountain ranges running right down its middle, and it's difficult to get around, and it's difficult, a lot of it is desert. And so, comparatively, between Mexico and the United States has the geography necessary for the good life. And he argues that peace is something that's important for the best life. And if you live in a time of peace, you're going to be able to live in the good life. Whereas if you live in the Ukraine right now, you're not going to be able to live the best possible life. So he argues that we need to be virtuous. And virtues are for him the habits of making the right decision. So for him, the best possible life is lived by somebody who's virtuous. For him, moderation is a virtue. Don't get too high, don't get too low, stay in the middle. Don't go too extreme, don't go too extreme one way or the other, stay in the middle. If you stay in the middle, you're going to be able to make good decisions. Courage is halfway between being foolhardy and being a coward. A courageous person is somebody who knows when to take a risk, as opposed to a coward never takes risks, and somebody who's foolhardy enters into risks without paying attention to them. Somebody who's funny is somebody that knows the difference between pushing too hard or not pushing far enough on a joke. Perseverance is somebody that knows when to push on, as opposed to somebody that pushes on into oblivion or somebody that doesn't push themselves at all. Patience is somebody that knows when to wait and when to play the long game, as opposed to somebody who's impulsive or somebody who never takes risks at all. He argues that generosity is a virtue. Somebody who's generous knows when to give and how much to give, as opposed to somebody who's stingy and doesn't give at all, or somebody who just gives it all away, and doesn't leave anything for themselves. Honesty is a virtue. Respect is a virtue. Aristotle argues that humans are relational beings, that we that we aren't ultimately individuals. Meaning we only come to know who we are through our relationships. That by ourselves we can't know who we are. And the primary relationship is the family. And what he argues is that if you want to live the best possible life, you need to live in a good family. And if you don't live in a good family, it doesn't mean that your life is not worth living. But what it means is that you're lacking something you need to live the best possible life. So he says that the next fundamental relationship in our life is the neighborhood. And it's probably not the case that you woke up this morning saying, neighborhood is what matters to me. And neighborhood is important for the quality of my life. But if we think about it, human beings are making decisions every day about neighborhoods. People are willing to pay a premium to live in certain neighborhoods. And the reason they want to live in certain neighborhoods is because people will look out for each other. People will look out for each other. People look out for their kids. People will look out for their property. And if you live in a good neighborhood, you have a quality of life that you can't get anywhere else. And if you live in a bad neighborhood, it impacts the quality of your life. The next relationship that matters to Aristotle is the city. And the city provides for a quality of our lives because a city provides specialization. It provides food. It provides restaurants. It provides education. It provides sanitation. And if you live in a good city, you have a quality of life that is superior to living in a poor city. So there's a big difference between living in Honolulu and Kabul, Afghanistan. There's a big difference between living in Minneapolis, Minnesota and Kiev, Ukraine. So the quality of our city impacts the quality of our life. He has a definition of this city. He argues that a city needs to be large enough to meet our needs, but small enough so that we can know everyone. So imagine that we live in Long Prairie, Minnesota, which is where my family ultimately came from. Long Prairie is a town of about 2,700 people. So if you live in Long Prairie and you're walking down the street and you see me drunk in the gutter, do you walk on by or do you drag me out of the gutter and bring me home and tell Rachel to keep me off the street because I'm a blight on the town? Say that again? Mm-hmm. Imagine that we're walking down in New York City and that you see somebody in the gutter. Do you walk on by Or do you stop and help that person? Aristotle says you're right. And he says that's the reason why, if we're sitting here, we can all figure out what the good life is. If you live in a city that's so large that you can't know everyone, it has a dehumanizing effect. And what it does is that it makes us insensitive to the needs of our fellow human beings. Because it's not that if we're in New York City and we walk by somebody, it's not because we're bad people. It's because we make a rational calculation in our mind. And the rational calculation is that if we stop and we help the person, by the time we finish helping the person and get back on our way, we're going to walk down the street and encounter another person and another. And we're never going to get anything done. And so if we live in New York City, we have to zone out our humanity from ourselves. We have to cut ourselves off from our humanity, and which is the reason why New Yorkers are rude. And if you spend your day in the city and you come home at night and you're walking down the street and your neighbor's out in the yard, do you stop and say hi, or do you walk on by? Yep, exactly. In a small town, you say hi. If you're working in the city and you go home at night and you're walking down your street and then your neighbor's in the front yard, Aristotle argues is that you don't say anything to them because you can't turn your humanity on and off. And so if you get into the house and you unlock your door and you go in and Rachel's cooking dinner, do I stop and greet Rachel, or do I walk on by and go into the living room and turn on the TV and decompress? I go into the TV room and decompress, and after about a half hour, I'll emerge and say hi to Rachel. The fourth relationship is friendship. And Aristotle argues that a friendship is a relationship that is something that nothing can take its place. So a friendship is a relationship that's essential for the best possible life. And it's essential because a friendship can answer you a question that no other relationship can answer for you. And that is, can I be loved for who I am? And in our world, we often see marriage as the place where that question can be answered. Can I be loved for who I am? But if you're in a marriage, you're with somebody in a covenant or a contract, and you're supposed to care for that person. And you care for that person whether they turned out the way that you want to or not. You care for that person whether you like them or not. A friendship is a relationship of choice. And it's a relationship where two people are involved in a relationship, and it's because they care for each other. And there's no contract. There's no obligation. And Aristotle argues that if you have in your life 2 or 3 really good friends, you have what's necessary for the best possible life. But Aristotle argues that there's another relationship that we need. Aristotle argues there's nothing we can imagine that if we get it, we won't become bored with it. Imagine your ideal house. Live in your ideal house for 3 years. Is it still your ideal house? Imagine your ideal car. Drive it for 3 years. Is it still your ideal car? Imagine your ideal cell phone. Have it for 6 months. Is it still your ideal cell phone? Aristotle argues there's nothing we can imagine that if we get it, we won't become bored with it. And the same is true of people. There's no person we can imagine that if we get them, we won't become bored with them. So we talk about the 7-year itch in marriages. A lot of marriages fail after 7 years. And that's because people become familiar with each other and they end up becoming bored with each other. And you probably see boredom in marriage relationships from where you're sitting. And Aristotle argues that that's a natural part of human relationship, is boredom. But the one thing that can satisfy us is for us to be in a relationship with a being that we could spend eternity seeking to know and never fully know. Aristotle argues that the only thing that can truly captivate us is for us to be in a relationship with a being that we could spend eternity seeking to know and never fully know. And for Aristotle, that's an activity called philosophy. St. Thomas Aquinas, when he read Aristotle in the Middle Ages, said that he was talking about God. Blaise Pascal said, there's a God-shaped hole in all of our hearts that only God can fill. And so Aristotle argues that only if we're in a relationship with God can we find fulfillment in our lives. And only when we can find fulfillment in our lives can we find fulfillment in friendship, in our cities, in our neighborhoods, and in our families. The most important of all of these is contemplation. Contemplating the divine. Aristotle was captivated by looking at nature. He looked at the stars, he looked at animals, he looked at all sorts of things. And he believed that there had to be something called a prime mover. Something that created the universe and put everything into motion. The problem is that relationships are hard. And we get hurt in relationship. We all know what pain is in relationship. Relationships in our family, relationships with lovers, relationships with friends. We all know that. And when we get hurt, we want to say, do I re-engage in relationship, or do I pull back and not engage in relationship anymore? I remember I was in the Jersey Shore in the spring of 1977, and I was with my college girlfriend, Patty, and we were walking down the beach, and I'll never forget the moment on the beach. And Patty looked at me and she said, let's just be friends. And it just slayed me, because let's just be friends is a code name for let's break up and never see each other again. And so it's a memory that brings up pain for me even now. And so relationships are hard. And when we get hurt in relationships, our temptation is to live as an individual. But to live as an individual requires means. It requires money. And in order to get independent means, you're going to have to work. And some people, a lot of us, could work our whole lives and never get enough means to live with freedom as an individual. So what kind of life is it if you spend your entire life seeking to get the wealth that you need to live as an individual and never get it? It's a sad life. But let's say you're one of the few and you're able to get the individual means. I think of Bruce Wayne. I think of him driving the Batmobile back to the Batcave at night. I think of him taking the elevator up to the kitchen level and making a meal for himself. And as he's sitting down at the table by himself to eat it, what's his first thought? I'm alone. So Aristotle argues that as we sit here today, each of us knows that wealth can't make us happy. That even if we get wealth, we're going to find ourselves lonely. So the means So in order to live the best possible life, we need to be in healthy relationships. So, what does Aristotle say about sexual ethics? Well, if you know anything about the Greeks, you'll know that they didn't have much of a negative idea toward homosexuality. But Aristotle argued that a sexual relationship should be confined to a marriage between a man and a woman. And the reason for that is that when you sexualize a relationship, you bring in a component of slavery into the relationship. You're trying to get something off of the other. So rather than a relationship being for the good of the other, the relationship becomes for the good of the self. And what sexuality is ultimately an appetite for Aristotle. And being an appetite, it's something that ultimately is not fulfilling. So he argued that the purpose of sex was procreation. And that sex should be confined to a marriage between a man and a woman. If it's in any other kind of relationship, it ultimately enslaves that relationship. It ultimately undermines that relationship. It ultimately damages that relationship. So, we've gone on for about 40 minutes, and Aristotle has made a case that humans are made for relationship. And how does this connect with the Bible? Love the Lord your God with all your mind, heart, and soul. And love your neighbor as yourself. Dane said yesterday that you studied Leviticus. And then when you studied Leviticus, you would have studied Leviticus 18, which is the sexual offenses section. And the sexual offenses section is seen to be bad news by our world. But Aristotle argues that it's good news. Because if you sexualize these other relationships, they damage those relationships. And that's something that the scripture knows well. So when St. Thomas Aquinas read Aristotle, what he argued was that Aristotle was the prophet of Christianity. He was somebody that understood Christianity before Christ. He was somebody that believed that Christianity was right before Christ. Do you have any questions?
Aristotle, he wasn't a Christian? Like he didn't,
No.
took on.
No, he lived 300 BC.
Why do you think then he took on so, like understood Christianity so well, but, or like, I guess, like preached it and prophesied it or whatever, but never, like, was a believer?
I think it's, Aquinas said that Aristotle was somebody that looked at the world for how it was. And that in Romans, when it talks about how we can know God by looking at our world. And Aquinas said that Aristotle was somebody that was able to look at the world and see it for how it was created to be. And was able to reason his way to all of these different insights. So, the reason I'm against same-sex marriage, it's not that I'm against it, it's what I'm for is good relationships. And what same-sex marriage ultimately does is it introduces an element of slavery into the relationship. Because it's not for, sex isn't for procreation, it's for what you're trying to get out of the other person. And so ultimately my argument is that the Christian teaching about sexuality is good news for everyone. Because it helps all of us to be able to live the way that we're made to live, the way that we are to live in good relationships. And you don't need to be married to be happy. You need to have a relationship with God. You need to have friendships. You need to live in a city, a neighborhood, a birth family. But you don't need to be married to be fulfilled. And I would say that in the evangelical tradition, we have a kind of a cult of marriage. And we believe that marriage is kind of the ultimate of all relationships. And if you're not married, you're somehow incomplete. And I don't believe that the scripture says that. In fact, Jesus says it would be better if you weren't married. But for your sinfulness, it's okay to be married. So Aristotle allows me to speak to non-Christian audiences about what I believe to be true about human relationship, human fulfillment, sexuality, marriage. So when I go speak to a secular university, like I spoke at the Columbia University School of Law, and it was an extremely tense night. But for a Jewish girl in the front row who came to my defense when I was being attacked, I would have not been allowed to finish my presentation. But I didn't quote scripture at all that night. I just spoke about Aristotle and his view of the world and how it applied to our lives. Any other questions?
This isn't about like Aristotle, but what do you do in situations when you're like being attacked and like protested and like you're just trying to give your presentation? Like what do you do?
Being a conflict-averse person, it's just really tense for me. I try to be graceful. I mean, I try to, because I'm speaking a hard message, I try to exercise grace in how I present. I try to exercise humility. And ultimately, I have to defer to my audience. My audience is the group I'm in relationship with when I'm presenting. And if they don't want to hear it, then I need to go. But what I want to do is I want to persevere and be there to put seeds in place, because I believe that the world we live in is a broken world, and the people that are at the presentation are broken people. All of us are broken, and I'm trying to give seeds of hope. Aristotle argued that there were 6 forms of government. So he argued that the primary foundation for government was either government for the good of the ruled or government for the good of the rulers. So a government by the good of the rule, a government of one person for the good of the ruled is a monarchy. The rule of one person for the good of the ruler is a tyranny. The rule of a few people for the good of the ruled is an aristocracy. A rule for the few people for the good of the ruler is an oligarchy. A rule for the good of the rulers for the many is a democracy. And the rule of the many for the good of the ruled is a polity or a republic. So on this side of the chart, Aristotle argues that this side is motivated by money. And that what ends up happening is that you're in a cycle of challenges between these various systems. So when there's a tyranny, the majority realizes that if they overthrow the tyrant, they can share in the wealth. So democracy emerges and overthrows the tyranny. But as time goes on, the few are going to gradually take over the democracy. And so the oligarchy ends up becoming formed. An oligarchy is ruled by property. And so gradually people's ambition is ultimately rooted into a tyranny. And a tyrant comes out of an oligarchy. And then the cycle begins all over again. So on the side of, for the good of the rulers, it's an eternal cycle of conflict over money between these various forces. And for the good of the ruled, he argued that the most stable of all governments was a republic, because the majority could reason. And the majority could reason that it was justice that mattered, not money. And if an aristocracy ruled, it was justice that mattered, not money. And if a monarch ruled, it was justice that mattered and not money. So where do you think America is on this chart?
Democracy.
What's the state of the middle class in America? It's what? It's in decline. So it's the middle class is in decline. And so we're becoming more of an oligarchy, ruled by the few, ruled by the wealthy. So to come back to my mom, when it comes to this kind of stuff, is it that you don't understand, or is it that you don't want to understand? Thanks. We'll take a break, 10-minute break.